Hi, Carlos. Thanks for joining me today. We're very honored to have you as our special guest in our DX Stories series.
Mm.
In the last year and a half, digital transformation has been at the forefront of many governments' priorities and agendas.
Mm.
I would say worldwide. And I think the pandemic have showed as well that the question around digital transformation is not if, but how and when. So our goal with this series of conversations that, as I said, we're beginning today, is a simple but I think important one. We want to provide a platform for people like yourself, people who are leading digital transformation processes to improve and transform governments, to share their stories with other leaders, other governments, other public agencies, private companies, citizens, so we can learn from your experience
Mm.
and act upon recommendations to overcome the challenges that we will also discuss today.
From the Development Bank of Latin America, CAF, we're quite delighted to share our thoughts in this space. Where I'm coming from and where a lot of our work and team is coming from is really more about the transformation bit than the digital bit. Digital transformation for us is more about transforming governments to deliver better services and to improve lives for people and for companies also, especially in developing countries and emerging economies. That's where I spent the last 20 years working. I've been working most of my career on public sector reform, state reform, anti-corruption, all these modernizations, efforts by governments around the world that are trying to better at delivering services to citizens. And I think what is happening in the last 10 years or so is that the digital sort of transformation has become like an enabler and a fantastic tool to accelerate this transformation of governments. And in the recent past, that has been especially accelerated by the pandemic, data has become the sort of not only the oil of the new economy, but the oil of the transformations of government. So there's a lot of hope and a lot of potential for new technologies and data to disrupt the way we were thinking about government, the way we are doing government, the way we are transforming government. So where I'm coming from in this space is really about, how we can leverage digital innovations and data insights to deliver better governments, both in the way governments operating in terms of being more agile, being more transparent, also being more accountable and more responsive, and also the way governments are relating to citizens. And I think that's the important thing.
Carlos, I think I was reading a study by CAF. I think by your own figures, you were estimated by 2030, I believe, the Latin American and Caribbean region in particular can close the if that region closed the digitalization gap vis-a-vis richer richer countries. Let's talk about the OECD, right? Group of governments. The region can have an exponential growth, right? And that could generate I think you were estimating a 500,000 jobs per year.
And there's really opportunities to leapfrog some of these challenges and to move forward. Amongst the most advanced digital countries around the world, you have Uruguay, you have Mexico. So my point here is that there are different realities in Latin America between countries, but also within countries, and I think that's the key challenge. And I think one of the challenges we face in the region in particular is about the digital divide, and the digital divide is increasingly not between countries, because a lot of countries are catching up in different ways, but most importantly within countries. The second issue I think that many countries face, but Latin America in particular, are threefold. There's still a challenge about digital connectivity, and the last, especially connectivity of good quality, of that is affordable and that is used for efficient and productive purposes. It's not only the issue of reaching the last mile, but there's an issue about the quality of connectivity and the reach of those connectivities. So you still have a problem around getting the connectivity to everybody so that no one is left behind. The other point is about the use of technologies by the public sector in different areas. And we see that the pandemic has accelerated, for example, the appropriation of new technologies in the education sector. But I think what has changed most during the pandemic is that before, even though public services were available online, they were not necessarily used by citizens. And I think that has changed. Now citizens, especially the youth, are not only using digital channels to interact with government or to get public services, but they are expecting those. And just to finalize, I think one of the challenges that the report that you're mentioning is underscoring is the appropriation of new technologies by companies and the private sector, especially in a region where over 95% of companies are small and medium companies. And the uptake of digital innovations and especially data insights by SMEs is still incipient in the region, especially when there's not a lot of regional integration. So there's an issue around the uptake of those technologies by companies.
And I see we are seeing increasingly how these issues matter to are top of the agenda of governments, but are also impacting the lives of our communities, of our citizens. And this is not in Latin America and the Caribbean, but I think more broadly speaking. I'm talking about cybersecurity issues, for instance. I'm talking about regulatory frameworks, how this can enable the adoption of technologies, and perhaps governance as well.
No, absolutely, Christopher. You're absolutely right. You have a number of building blocks. But I think one of the things that has changed and that has accelerated a lot in the last couple of years, even before the pandemic, but especially now, is that governments are really now taking that agenda much more seriously. And having these building blocks is also having a real clear strategy, a vision, and a tone from the top. And a lot of countries in Latin America have really accelerated their, getting the house in order so that all these building blocks that you mentioned are really put together in a comprehensive strategy with a governance framework behind that is stronger. For example, you look at the case of Peru. Peru in the last 3 years have really put together the different building blocks, really comprehensive strategy, a governance framework with responsibilities on the different building blocks, strategy to strengthen human talent, especially in the public sector and for the public sector, a number of cross-cutting tools or enablers that are required, digital payment, for example, digital identity. One of the key challenges I think that a lot of countries are also facing, and you mentioned, for example, cybersecurity and these other things, it's also the importance of dealing with legacy systems. Because digital transformation has not started now. We've been doing digital transformation of governments for the last 20 years or 30 years, especially in public finance and in other areas. And so you have a lot of legacy systems. So a lot of countries are now also struggling to see how you deal with the transition from your old to the new systems you want to operate.
Yes, I think that we are seeing it's much more visible the political will, and that to a large extent, I think it's a very good step that is being reflected in some cases in strategies, in policies.
Yeah, I think that you need to put your money where your mouth is in terms of having a strategy and implementing it. These are state policies. And when you look at the experience of countries, I think governments around the region, whether they are left or right, they really understand that this is a transformation that needs to stick over time, that needs to be a long-term investment, a long-term effort that needs to be sequenced. We recently did a very interesting study around the case of Portugal. Portugal is not necessarily the most developed country in Europe, but has been able to leapfrog these digital transformations and now is one of the most advanced digital countries around the world. And I think one of the lessons from countries like Portugal or Uruguay is the reforms that have been undertaken have been long-term reforms, 10 years, 15 years, with the same, not necessarily the same policies, but the same vision, with some initiatives that have been sticking in the long term, and that you're building the transformation progressively on blocks. And I think that has been a really very big lesson, that these policies are not necessarily like a fad from a specific government.
Let me move on perhaps with a topic that I find very interesting. And perhaps this is the correlation between digital transformation and trust. Trust plays a crucial role, I think, in these digital transformation processes. Citizens, for instance, should be comfortable and trust how their governments are using their data.
And a lot of choices we're making now are going to define whether the way governments are handling your data will increase or decrease trust. Because at the same time, you have the Pegasus scandals, you have a lot of issues that are making people very nervous, especially in an economy that is increasingly digital and where the companies that have most valuation in the market are all the companies basically monetizing your data. We need to find the balance between sort of privacy and security on one hand, but also the ability to leverage those data to improve lives and innovation in the economy. And one of the areas we've seen that where you have a lot of hope, sometimes a lot of hype, is the potential of these digital innovations and data analytics, if you will, as a tool for anti-corruption. This is a debate that is maybe more for developing countries and emerging markets, but we've seen during the pandemic that especially emergency procurement has been very vulnerable to corruption in all countries. But I would say that one of the things we've seen is two things. The first thing is, let's say, all the actors managing public finance and controlling the use of public resources have been much more digital and data savvy, using artificial intelligence robots to spot corruption risk in public procurement, for example. Digital transformation strategies can be even more effective anti-corruption strategies than those strategies that are called anti-corruption, and precisely because they are not called anti-corruption. So these applications of technologies in traditional policies are also improving, let's say, not only the transparency, but I would say the integrity and the efficiencies of those policies.
Carlos, as usual, you're enjoying the conversation. It just goes too fast. It has been great sharing this first conversation of our DX series. I love to discuss more synergies and opportunities how we can work together. And thank you again and your team for facilitating this.